Thanks, Gina. Thanks, you guys. So I am a lawyer, and I am a doctor from the past. My practice primarily is defending pharmaceutical and medical device companies in litigation, mass tort litigation. And just by way of disclosure, I currently represent Medtronic in the hernia mesh litigation, so that's near and dear to my heart, as is mesh. So, the first thing that I wanted to say, you guys, I think this is obviously something you're seeing in your practice. You're seeing this in your offices. As we've heard today, patients are coming asking questions or concerns. And keep in mind a couple of things. There is a ton of advertising right now on the internet from plaintiffs' law firms about hernia mesh litigation. And unfortunately, like most things on the internet, some of it's true and some of it is false, and lots of it is hard to understand. But it involves every single manufacturer that makes mesh product is being sued or suits are being sought against those manufacturers. So it's not specific to any specific company. And more importantly, it's not specific to any particular mesh. And I think that's a really big thing to understand. So if you look here, this is just a snapshot of what we're seeing in the complaints that are being filed against Medtronic, but also against the other manufacturers. It doesn't matter what material they're making the product from. It doesn't matter if it's coated or uncoated. It doesn't matter whether it's macroporous, microporous, or somewhere in between. It doesn't matter what the weight of the product it is. It doesn't matter how it's knitted or how it's woven. There is no such thing in these suits as a good mesh. And I think that the point that you have to understand and keep in mind is what happens in the courtroom, what happens in litigation is very different from what you guys see in your practice. This is not science, this is not medicine. It's informed by science and medicine, but it is different. And what's being told in the courtrooms, which you're going to be hearing in these lawsuits, are that there is such a thing as a perfect mesh. And whatever mesh is at issue there is not it. And it doesn't matter what the design is. The injuries are things you would absolutely expect and know. These are all known risks of your procedures, whether mesh is used or not. And not surprisingly, that's the injuries that we're seeing. So you're seeing recurrences and reoperations. That's the biggest one. And those are big ticket items. But infections, adhesions, bowel obstructions, fistulas, and anything else you can imagine. And it's literally thousands and thousands of cases across the country alleging these kind of injuries. It's a big deal. And this is obviously FDA. FDA actually took a look at surgical complications related to hernia repair. And they looked at this in the context of both repairs that are done with mesh, be that synthetic, bioabsorbable, biologic, or without mesh. And not surprisingly to you guys, they identify what are the most common risks that are associated with those procedures, and they overlap almost 100% with the injuries that we're hearing in these cases. So why does this matter to you guys? One of the questions, we work with a lot of physicians, surgeons particularly in this litigation, who serve as experts for us or consult for us. And one of the first things they want to know is, well, how is this going to impact my practice? I'm seeing this from my patients, I'm getting asked questions, I'm having to deal with this, but what are my risks? So the first thing I will tell you, and this is something I think that should calm you a little bit, you are not the target. All right, you're not the target for the plaintiffs, generally speaking, and you're certainly not the target for the manufacturers. These litigations right now, they're all about the big pockets, and the big pockets are in the industry that's making these products. So the manufacturers, be that Medtronic or any others, those are the target. Doesn't mean that a doctor can't occasionally get wrapped into it, but physicians and surgeons are very rarely named in these lawsuits, and when they are, they typically get dismissed at a pretty early stage. And the reasons for that are twofold. One is, again, the deeper pockets issue, who's got the real money, and that's the manufacturers. And the other one is that your testimony, if you ever get involved in this case, let's say one of the cases involves a patient on which you did a hernia repair surgery. The plaintiffs are going to want to have a deposition of you as the treating physician, as a surgeon, and ask you questions about that repair. The last thing they want to hear from you is something negative to their case. If they're suing you, you're ultimately an adversary to them. So from the plaintiff's perspective, it's much better to have you on their team. And frankly, from the unbiased perspective, obviously from the defendant's and manufacturer's perspective, it's the same thing. You as the physician have an incredible role in that case if you're ever involved, because you are fundamentally the one unbiased party that can provide insight into what actually happened. And by no means am I saying there's no such thing as a mesh that has a problem or a mesh that's defective for a variety of reasons. But my point simply is that in those cases, you are unlikely to be the person that's targeted. You're much more likely to be the person that's sought after, whether that's by the plaintiffs or by the defendants, to get your testimony, to get your insight and your guidance as to what you think happened. Is there a defect in the mesh? What happened in the surgery? What was the problem? Are the allegations that are being made consistent with the medicine? Or are the allegations simply consistent with the fact that you have a complaint that wants to make money? And those are two things can coexist. Those two are real and legitimate things. So as I mentioned, physicians and surgeons can be involved in two ways. One is as a fact witness. So that's what I was just talking about right now, is if you have a case that's filed as a complaint, whether that's federal court or state court, and that case goes to what's called discovery. And discovery is where both sides get to ask questions, take depositions, so on and so forth. If you happen to be the surgeon who put that mesh in, it is highly likely that one side or the other will reach out to you and say, hey, you did this surgery, we'd like to take your deposition. Typically, you get compensated for your time doing that, but it's a process. It's 4, 5, 6, 7 hours sitting in a room with lawyers. And lawyers like to talk and ask questions, and they're not often that fun to talk to. I'm sure that's not the best part of your day. But you can get involved in that way. But remember, in that context, again, like I said, that's about you providing your true, full impressions of what happened during your case, what you think happened, what you did. It's not about placing blame on you. And keep that in mind. That's really important. And your testimony really does matter. I mean, in these cases, aside from the science, right? So when the manufacturers come out, they're going to say, look, here's the data on my mesh. It doesn't support an increased risk of whatever the injury is. The plaintiffs are going to come out with whatever evidence they have. Each side is experts who are going to be presenting that information. But at the end of the day, if you think about a jury, right, and if you think about the people who are listening to these cases, they're lay people. They're not doctors. They're not scientists. And when they walk into that room, what do they want to hear? They want to hear the physician, who is the person trained in this area, the surgeon, tell them what happened. And the experts that are on each side are paid consultants, right? And the jury is smart enough to discount to some extent. Obviously, if you're retained by Medtronic or if you're retained by plaintiffs, there's a certain implicit bias in that. There doesn't have to be, but that's the way it's viewed. The one person sitting at that table who's unbiased is the person who actually did the surgery. So your testimony, be that in deposition, be that in trial, is actually incredibly relevant and incredibly powerful. So keep that in mind, and it's both for your patient, because you are their surgeon, but it's also for whatever the truth is and whatever you did, whatever the procedure is. Those things are really important. So some smart practice tips. I mean, Doc, we started off, you guys had such a nice overview of hernia mesh, of the features, and we talked about, good practice tips earlier in terms of the labeling for mesh products. I think that's an incredibly good idea, Jeff. But it goes to this whole process. What is really important for you guys? So no one in this room wants complications. No one in this room wants to have a problem. And no one in this room wants a patient to sue them. But realistically speaking, that's a perfect world, and it's not always perfect. So how do you minimize your risk of being the person who's sued? In the hernia mesh context specifically, but generally in your practice. And number one, this is shown over and over in every single study, is you're talking to your patients. It's the doctors who have a good rapport with their patients, and that means when they walk in for a consult, it means when they're going into the ER, it means when they come out of the ER, and when they follow up with your clinic. If you don't talk to them, if you don't engage with them, if you don't listen to their questions or their concerns, or you dismiss those, you're going to have a problem. And the reason is simple. It's human nature. If I like you, I don't want to sue you. If I think you're arrogant, disconnected, disinterested, and you just want to get out and finish and go to the next room, and guess what? You're tired. You have a long day. You have a lot of patients. It's not surprising. But if that's the way I feel about you as your patient, I'm not going to like you very much. And then even if it's not that I don't like you, if I can't connect with you, then I have no reason not to sue you because there's money there, okay? So your connection to your patients, your discussion, the way they view you, if they like you, the chances they're going to sue is incredibly small. If they can't remember the name of their surgeon, you may have a problem. And documentation is what Jeff mentioned in terms of the lot numbers, and that's incredibly important from your perspective, is what was the product, what was the size, what was the lot. All those things are for you to track, but also it's important from a legal perspective, but it's a lot more than that. You want to document what conversations you had with your patients, and we all are used now with this form consent. You got these forms that you fill out and do check marks. Let me tell you, that's not as good as a note saying, hey, I had a conversation with Mrs. Smith. I explained to her the rest of the procedure, including X, Y, and Z. After the procedure, we had X, Y, and Z happen. I explained to her, discussed that. Here are my notes. If that's in the record, that's incredibly powerful. If I come across a medical record where there's very little documentation of the physician's interaction with the patient's discussions about whether you're discussing what kind of mesh are you going to use, right? Hey, there's options. The patient has questions. You discussed that with them. You said, this is synthetic, this is biological, bioresorbable. We made a decision together. This would be the right one. That's a lot better than nothing. And the patient comes back and said, I didn't want the synthetic mesh in, and there's nothing in here talking about that. Think about what you're documenting. I know you have limited time, but think about what's priority information, what you're documenting. And this is the other thing, is know your products, right? And this is the reality of what Jeff said. The boxes don't necessarily have all the information, and if you're using a mesh, you want to make sure that you can say, honestly, I've read the instructions for use, right? I'm familiar with the specifics of this mesh. And get comfortable with that, because at deposition, one of the questions you're going to get asked is, so doctor, you put in this X, Y, and Z synthetic mesh. What material was it made at? What was the pore size? Why did you choose that mesh? What characteristic led you to choose that mesh in this procedure? And if your answer is, well, that happens to be the box that's stocked in my OR, that's not really the best answer. And so I'm sure you guys do this stuff, but it's always good to remind her. And the last thing is, I'll close on this. What you guys do is incredibly important. Each and every day, you're taking care of patients and making their lives better. And you have years of training, years of expertise, years of practice. You need to trust that in this. There's a lot going on in the world around hernia mesh on the manufacturer side, on the litigation side. That's stuff that we deal with. You're dealing with the medicine. Know your science, know your clinical, and trust your expertise that you're making the right judgments for your patients. When you document and you communicate, I can't guarantee you're not going to get sued, but your chances get really, really low. Okay? So thanks for having me here, you guys. Gina and Jeff, appreciate it.